My name is Dr. Dave Simbora. Behind me is Dr. Clark Campbell and Norlin Hernandez, and we all come from Biola University, specifically from Rosemead School of Psychology. And I'll let them introduce themselves a little bit when it's their turn to present. My role at Rosemead is as Associate Dean of Doctoral Programs. I also been blessed to be a past president here at NCSBP, and I think I've been here 14 years. This has been just a wonderful home in terms of growing up professionally. Our talk today is Cultural Humility, Framework, Clinical Application, Individual and Institutional Accountability. Each of the three of us will take a piece of this. My role to introduce it will be to introduce the concept of cultural humility and to trace its history as well as its applicability. And then my colleagues behind me will also be taking it further into the clinical domain as well as the academic and institutional domain. So my talk is Cultural Humility, a path worth taking. And it's important that we start any discussion with the discussion of my pets. This is Roxy and Peyton. They are boxers. Roxy's about 8, Peyton's about 3. And I wanted to introduce you to Roxy and Peyton because Roxy and Peyton have based their lives in canine reality. Let me tell you about canine reality. In canine reality, when I come home, my dogs, Roxy and Peyton, are very excited to see me. So before I even get out of the car, they are at the gate waiting. And by waiting, I mean tails, or what little tails they have, wagging, jumping on the gate. And I walk in, and I walk through the gate, and they're starting to jump on me. And they basically, ultimately, make me feel one word: awesome. Right? So I come to the gate, and in contrast, my children might barely look up, hey Dad. If I'm lucky, they might throw a couple of syllables together, like, hey, good to see you, Dad, right? But Roxy and Peyton are just demonstrably enthusiastic. Now, what's interesting about Roxy and Peyton is they have very short memories for any time I am not, quote, awesome. So, for example, let's say I forget to feed them. Okay, so 5 o'clock they normally get fed. Let's say it's about 8 o'clock and I come home. And I'd left and I come home. They are still just as excited to see me. And they jump around and everything. Let's say I don't take Roxy and Peyton for a walk for a week. They are thrilled to still see me. So what's interesting to me about this relationship I have with Roxy and Peyton is it is truly a consequence-free relationship. I am not held accountable to any standard of behavior. They always are thrilled to be around me. So let me tell you, I love living in canine-based reality. Because in canine-based reality, we are awesome at everything. And we are never held responsible for our shortcomings. So I really, really enjoy this. However, the problem is it's not true. This is not reality. And the reality is that I'm about as imperfect as they come. In fact, I have more imperfections than anything good about me. Right? I can't make it through a day without making mistakes, foibles, miscommunicating, hurting someone. Now, in canine-based reality, well, that matters because I just stay awesome. But in reality, I'm not so awesome. What I want to submit to you is that the reality of not being so awesome is actually the reality that is really worth living. And the not being so awesome part demands a characteristic of humility. And that I believe the most important path to live, to walk through, is one that is indwelling with humility. So a couple thoughts on humility, some reflections on humility. First, Mahatma Gandhi: it is unwise to be too sure of one's own wisdom. It is healthy to be reminded that the strongest might weaken and the wisest might err. Confucius: humility is the solid foundation of all the virtues. King Solomon: haughtiness or pride goes before destruction, but humility precedes honor. And with Martin Luther King holiday here a few days ago, I love this quote from him: "The darkness of racial injustice will be dispelled only by the light of forgiving love. For more than 3 centuries, American Negroes have been frustrated by day and bewilderment by night by unbearable injustice. and burdened with the ugly weight of discrimination. Forced to live with these shameful conditions, we are tempted to become bitter and retaliate with a corresponding hate. But if this happens, the new order we seek will be little more than a duplicate of the old order. And then catch this. We must, in strength and humility, meet hate with love. If none of these quotes really get you, we'll end with Ann Landers. Don't accept your dog's admiration as conclusive evidence that you are wonderful. All right, so let's talk about some definitions of humility. Davis, Worthington, and Hook in 2010 understand humility as both having intra and interpersonal components. And I actually, when I read their stuff and I think about it, I actually think the intra and the interpersonal are not as easily distinguished as we might think when we first read through these definitions. They're actually very interconnected. And we'll see this when we talk about the intrapersonal. In order to have a humble position in life, one must have an accurate self-representation. Now, we throw this term around in psychology a lot, like how accurately do you see yourself? Do we understand really how hard it is to see ourselves accurately? I have a friend who's a social psychologist that works with us at Rosemead, and when we go out to lunch, I'm very fond of hearing him tell me story after story of social psychology, what's going on in social psychology. And if I were to sum up all of the studies he's ever told me over the 15 years I've known him, it's that we do a horrible job of evaluating ourselves accurately. It's almost like that is the main foundation of his research and areas of knowledge in social psychology. And I love kind of learning about that we deceive ourselves. And I would submit to you that one of the best ways to see ourselves accurately is not so much from an intrapersonal domain, in other words, self-scrutiny, but allowing other scrutiny to come in. The company that we keep. I tell my students this all the time. If you surround yourself with people who only praise you, you're doing yourself a massive disservice. And that includes your supervisors. Ask your supervisors to critique you. Because we're people too, and we want to be applauded. And it's hard to critique. The gentlemen behind me are two of those people in my life who I've invited to critique me. And it stinks when they do, right? But it's necessary for me to have an accurate view of myself. Watch the company you keep. Are they committed to helping you see yourself as you really are, not as you want to be seen or as you think you might be? If we have a good community around us, we'll be less inclined to distort information to self-enhance. Interpersonally, we need to maintain, if we're going to be humble people, an interpersonal stance that is other-oriented. This flies right in the face of our acculturation into Western society that says me first. Right? I talked to my students about the message from the military in terms of recruiting over the last 40, 50 years, right? Ask not what you can do ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country 50, 60 years ago. Through the 80s, in my adolescence, it was, here's what the Army can do for you, and an all for one for all, not so much. It's an army of one. It's for me. Right? The focus is on what the military can do for me. And that shift reflects this shift in Western culture of identification with the self, which we all know very much about. Humility is the opposite stance. It's a countercultural stance to actually go through life with a focus on the other, which involves respect for others, lack of superiority, empathy, gentleness, equality, gratitude, and acknowledging mistakes. All of these get referenced in the definition of humility. So I would submit to you this, that humility is the harder path. It really is. Very hard to do life from a position of humility. Chris Jammy is a contemporary poet and author and DJ. And Chris Jammy, I like two of his quotes. To share your weakness is to make yourself vulnerable. To make yourself vulnerable is to show your strength. And then the biggest challenge after success is shutting up about it. Right? We are in a field that almost demands that we talk about what we've done. Right? What is a Vita? Right? Here's my list of all the things I've conquered. Right? All the things I've done. The intersection of culture and humility, as I prepare to hand off to my colleagues, involves the ability to maintain an interpersonal stance that is other-oriented, in relation to aspects of cultural identity that are most important to the other. Now, I do not want to contradict Dr. Nadal from this morning because I think he made some excellent points. What I want to do is supplement some of his points, and that those things that we think are the most important in terms of advocacy may not be the things that are the most important in terms of advocacy for our clients' lives. That a culturally humble stance acknowledges that which we value so much, but puts at the forefront that which the other values so much. And so advocacy, in my opinion, needs to take into account other-orientedness, not just self or our field's decisions about what is best. Okay? We need to express respect, express a lack of superiority when cultural differences occur, rarely assume competence, and work collaboratively. Implications. Cultural humility is a way of being with clients rather than a way of doing therapy. It's more of an ideographic approach than a nomothetic approach. It involves critique of the self, not just reflection. Huge difference. This is not about us just kind of sitting in the background and meditating on who we are. It's a critique of who we are to ultimately be in more service to the other. Lifelong learning, no endpoint. Personal and institutional accountability, not just knowledge acquisition. I want to trace for you the case for why cultural humility, I think, is a great paradigm for us to take forward. This actually comes within a long list of other areas of cultural identification. First is the idea of cultural competency. This is something we talk about routinely with our students. It's all over the SOA, the Standards of Accreditation, the idea of being competent cultural psychologists. When I went to grad school in the early 90s, I ended up going to an internship at the University of New Mexico, and my main advisor was Dr. Luis Vargas at the Health Sciences Center there. And he talked to me a lot about this idea of competency and how that was a term he struggled with. So this is 1996, okay? He said, Dave, I don't like the term competency. I know that's kind of the thing we talk about now, but I don't like it. I like the term cultural responsiveness. And the idea of cultural responsiveness, and then he ends up going basically over all the slides I just showed you, right? So 20 plus years ago, he was talking about these ideas of no endpoint, lifelong learning, humble approach, respect for others, that we never truly become competent. In fact, that shouldn't even be part of our framework. And I remember wrestling with that and thinking, wow, I really appreciate that. So I ended up taking some of his readings and writings and using that in multicultural classes that I was teaching at Rosemead, starting in '97. And I would say this to students, hey, now this competence thing, I think it's really important to think about a competency, but that's got some dangerous implications, right? It is so fun for me to be able to present to you today, 20 years later, how our field has really gravitated away from that term competence and its underpinnings to something that is more sort of vital, sort of lifelong. Couple of thoughts. Our cultural competency framework, we know it well, coming from Sue and others in '92, pushed forward with a knowledge, skills, and attitudes base that comes out furthered more by APA in 2003. This is what many of us were raised in. That reaction to competency was cultural responsiveness in the 90s with Vargas and Cosciolino. That cultural responsiveness ends up morphing into a term called cultural orientation, which is about 7, 8 years old. Okay? And I have a couple sites for you here. Owen et al., Sue et al. Talked about orientation, the idea of being with the client guided by the therapist's philosophy or values. And from this idea of cultural orientation, we've developed this idea of cultural humility. So cultural humility comes within this much larger framework, and just a quick show and tell here, a lot of what we've talked about is written about here, and I have a couple of sites on here were from this book by Hook, Davis, Owen, and DeBlaire, Cultural Humility, Engaging Diverse Identities in Therapy. What I find really interesting, knowing that cultural humility comes out of competency, responsiveness, and orientation, if we go back and we look at those quotes of some of the major philosophers and benefactors of those eras, Confucius, etc., they're talking about the same things. In some ways, there's nothing new under the sun here. that the idea of living a life that is humble, to me, is the most noble path one could take. Now let's take that idea and apply it to cultural thinking, cultural practice, cultural teaching, cultural engagements. So today we're going to continue to talk about this. My colleagues will. We'll talk about the value added of a culturally humble perspective. We're going to take a look at it within the therapy room. Dr. Campbell will talk about that, as well as within the supervision dyad or supervision group setting. What does a culturally humble stance look like in those two contexts? And then our colleague Norlin Hernandez will talk about it within academia. And also within academia, the personal narrative of what it's like to be an up-and-coming professional within an academic realm and taking a culturally humble stance. I want to close with a quote from Heraclitus of Ephesus: "The unlike is joined together, and from differences results the most beautiful harmony." That is our goal here. With that, Dr. Campbell.
Thank you, Dave. I think I'll just do this old school and sit down for my time, and hopefully that will work fine. Dave mentioned a little bit about his experience with NCSPP, and I echo that. This has been a great organization. I think I've been coming here for over 20 years, and I think in 2010 I was the president, so it's been a wonderful organization. I appreciate that. We've had the opportunity to work together on this presentation, and as Dave just gave a great introduction to this and talked about cultural competence versus cultural humility and how they might fit together and yet be different. It sets the place for the clinical context. And so that's what I want to talk about here today, is just the clinical work, and if cultural humility is good in and of itself, does it really work? And does it work in the cultural context or the clinical context? Is this on? Okay. Can you all hear me, though? Okay. So I'll talk about the therapeutic relationship and outcomes and therapeutic tasks, and then also with supervision. Most of this work has really come out just in the last few years. And so it's just been in 5 years or so. Oh, I went the wrong way. I see. Okay, there we go. In the last 5 years that they've been doing a lot of work on this. And probably this book is one. There's several articles on cultural humility now. And they have done research on over 2,000 clients. And from that, it says the findings from these studies demonstrate that clients who have their therapist as more, who view their therapist as more culturally humble, have better therapy outcomes, including key therapeutic processes such as the working alliance. So there seems to be some good mounting evidence for cultural humility in the clinic. One of the kind of classic pieces on the therapeutic relationship is on the therapeutic alliance by Borden, and there's described as having 3 components: the therapeutic bond, therapeutic goals, and therapeutic tasks. The bond really is the trust and attachment that exists between the therapist and the client, whereas the goals are really what it is that you're trying to do, the aims, and of course the tasks are those methods that would be used to achieve those goals. What's found is that cultural humility seems to increase the therapeutic bond, so that trust and attachment between the therapist and the client. So that's the impact that it can have. I'm hoping I can describe a little bit more what that looks like in the clinical arena. So what does cultural humility look like in terms of cultural identities and worldview in the therapeutic setting? I think one of the things that we're always trying to do with our students and model for them is the ability to sit with someone else who may have an extremely different worldview, who may have completely different experiences and have opinions of your own and your own experiences, and yet not put that on the client that you're working with. You want to be able to let the person have their own experience and not take that away from them, but to support them in their agency in making choice and change. So, I think there's a lot of goodness in that, not just in the clinical arena, but even in our world at large. Could we have conversations and disagree, but in really helpful, constructive ways? So I think that's really what the cultural humility is ultimately about. It is other-oriented, so it is helping to have a dialogue with someone, to see the world through their eyes and support them in their experience, and yet helping them explore a little bit their own cultural experience, and at times, as appropriate, sharing some of your own cultural experience that might be helpful in the clinical work. The dialogue like this is going to create anxiety, so it's easy to avoid this. It is very easy to either take a stance where I am the expert, I am competent, I will tell you what to do, and that's the danger in cultural competence language. We're comfortable with that primarily, I think, because we're used to thinking of ourselves as competent. And yet here with cultural humility, it's taking an open position. It's essentially saying, I may be wrong. This is what I think. These are my experiences. I may be wrong. Help me learn about you. And so it's that other orientation, not the expert, but helping someone come to that point where they can value the other person, even though they may see the world in a very different way. So often this requires some personal work on the part of the therapist to develop their own understanding of themselves and begin to hold their perspectives a little more lightly. As Dave mentioned, there is an interpersonal and an intrapersonal aspect to cultural humility. Interpersonally, it's much like we would think of empathy, seeing the world through another person's eyes and valuing their experience and communicating that understanding back to them. Intrapersonally, it's really a deep understanding of one's own experience and how it developed, and encouraging that in the development and experience of your client. So that this is based essentially on getting feedback from others. As Dave mentioned, there's that important part of not just knowing about yourself, but continuing to learn about yourself through obtaining feedback. Some more on the findings of this is that the findings from University Counseling Center on 247 clients is that clients who rated their therapists higher in cultural humility reported better therapy outcomes. Clients who reported that their therapists engaged in cultural discussions had better treatment outcomes. Outcomes were associated with the client's perception of the therapist's cultural presence in the session. And it's the client's perception of the cultural humility of the therapist that really counts in this. So there's a delicate balance of responding and engaging the client appropriately on relevant cultural topics, yet also allowing the client to have agency in bringing up issues as they are ready to deal with those, and not pushing or forcing that on a client. Cultural humility and microaggressions in therapy. We heard some about that this morning, and of course we've known about that for a number of years, that microaggressions happen pretty easily and pretty readily, unfortunately. Here's one study. They studied 128 racial ethnic minority individuals and the microaggressions they experienced in therapy. They found that cultural humility mediated, they had a structural modeling kind of research design they were using, and it mediated the relationship between the negative effects of the rupture and the counseling outcome. So cultural humility was seen as a helpful aspect of recovering from microaggressions. It's interesting to me to note how often microaggressions occur in therapy. So here's a study in 2016 on over 2,000 racial ethnic minority clients. 81% reported experiencing at least one microaggression in therapy. I think that's important for us to know, and important for our students to know, that this is not just something that is going to happen when they're riding on the bus or sitting in a waiting room, but this is something that happens in the clinical office as well. Client perceived cultural humility of the counselor was associated with fewer microaggressions experienced in the counseling, and I'll say in the recovery of the relationship once a microaggression had occurred. So again, it affects the bond, the therapeutic bond, so that trust and attachment that's so important in the therapeutic relationship. Well, a little bit about cultural humility and the therapeutic tasks. These, again, are the methods one uses in sessions to achieve the goals, and hopefully these are mutually agreed upon, and they need to be consistent with the cultural identity and experience of the client so that it can facilitate healthy functioning. As I said, the tasks need to be mutually agreed upon so that microaggressions are minimized. And I use a couple of examples here of cognitive behavior therapy and psychodynamic therapy. If these are the methods, general Uber methods being used to address the issues and the goals that the client brings in, I think we have to be careful about what are the expectations that the client may have. Like, for instance, in terms of structure, does your client, based on some of their past cultural experience, depend on you as the therapist providing the kind of structure that would lead toward healthy therapeutic progress? And there's a difference oftentimes in the structure in CBT-rated aligned therapy and psychodynamic therapy. Or are they more expecting a kind of passive, I'll lead the way kind of experience that might be more of a client-centered kind of approach, or more of a let's explore the unconscious a bit more in the psychodynamic arena. So looking at the expectations that clients may have on the change process from what they've learned from their own cultural experience and helping to be aligned with that in the therapeutic tasks is going to be extremely important. Finally, I want to cover just a few things on supervision and cultural humility. Cultural humility can facilitate the effectiveness of clinical supervision through both modeling and teaching. So this is modeling cultural humility within supervision, and then on teaching cultural humility through outside activities that you may recommend to your supervisee outside of the supervision session. So 3 reasons why cultural humility is important in supervision, and that is, 1, it facilitates a strong working alliance. So this isn't really founded in an empirical way. This is more of a kind of a rational way. If cultural humility promotes a strong working alliance in therapy, it would stand to reason that cultural humility would promote a strong working alliance in supervision as well. And it necessitates that the supervisor has become more aware of his or her own cultural background and the impact that that has on their personal work and on their supervision. And then thirdly, cultural humility models a way that supervisees can engage with clients. I think we all know that a lot more happens in the modeling in supervision than in just what is said. How many of us have taken the ways we've seen our supervisor respond to us and somehow utilize that in therapy? Usually that's the most strong or most impactful part of the supervision. And then supervisors demonstrate awareness of cultural differences that may exacerbate the power differential in the supervisory relationship. So we need to be aware of that, and it's one of the reasons why the cultural humility, the kind of holding lightly, is an important aspect of this in the supervisor. Cultivate an attitude of openness, curiosity, and interest. I'm just interested in you, and not in you knowing about me, but I'm interested in you and your experience. If we can communicate that to our supervisees, they will automatically, I think, become more bonded and appreciate that experience. And we initiate conversations about identity and cultural diversity. So again, the anxiety that's created around initiating that conversation, but showing that you're open to it without forcing your perspective as the supervisor onto the supervisee, is great modeling and encourages openness among the supervisee. and invite supervisees to consider the ramifications of their ongoing cultural dialogue. I think one of the things that happens is unintended consequences. We're having these conversations in supervision or with our clients and not realizing that what they may take out of that may have unintended consequences in their other relationships. So it may be helpful for their growth in the current situation they have, but maybe at times helping them understand that this may not go over so well with your mom and dad, or may not go over so well with your spouse. That, in other words, these are things to help them think about how they hold this lightly rather than push forward with it. So it's a respectful dialogue that instills the values in the supervisee. Teaching cultural humility to supervisees with outside activities. One of the things that is discussed in some of these studies is the ABC model, simply helping supervisees assess their strengths and weaknesses, perhaps using a cultural genogram in that process. Build a plan for your supervisees to proactively develop cultural humility, and then connecting, encouraging the supervisee to connect with the culturally diverse individuals and groups to expand their experience and to respond in openness. So in conclusion of my part of this, the original question that was posed was, does this cultural humility model actually help our clients? And I think the answer at this point is yes. Again, these are relatively recent studies, but there is quite a bit of accumulated evidence that this is very helpful. It deepens the therapeutic alliance, it's greater engagement with clients, it brings fewer microaggressions and fewer negative effects when relational rupture through microaggression does occur, and there's better therapeutic outcomes. So I think there's reason to value this if you're thinking of knowledge, skills, attitudes, this attitudinal cultural humility aspect. Frankly, I think this is actually the telos of multicultural training. I think we've moved beyond some of the previous reasons for why we're doing this. Maybe this is where we need to be at this point in our training. So with that, I want to turn this over to Norlin Hernandez. Thank you. Yeah.
Buenas tardes, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. My name is Norlan Hernandez, and I have the easy task of bringing this home. And I thank you ahead of time for not giving in to the temptation to close your eyes. I am thankful for the committee that planned a very light lunch. So my part is really bringing cultural humility through a minority narrative lens. So I want to set a disclaimer that a lot of what I'm going to cover is just really personal things. I'm going to be vulnerable with you, so I thank you for your patience and for embracing that. But I also want to set the disclaimer that this is just a narrative. It's not the narrative, so it shouldn't be used as a blanket experience for all minority narrative. So I'm going to make that very explicit with some of the narratives that have affected me personally. So to start, I just wanted to set the foundation with what Nassar McMillan said in regards to barriers for the minority and what we experience, stating that individuals representing a minority status in ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, or socioeconomic standing may face multiple forms of oppression or synergistic barriers. Now, some of those barriers, she goes on to say that they have to do with social, cultural barriers, political, educational, employment, and language and accessibility. And I wanted to use this because I've experienced some of those barriers, and I'm going to talk about some of those and try to bring it home. So, furthermore, I wanted to also talk about or show you, and again, this is the part where I become vulnerable, some of an insight into some of the cultural biases that I had growing up. And that I had and I've experienced in the family setting, in the educational system, in my professional environment as well. So Hook, Davis, Owen, DeBlair, they say, cultural biases can come from a variety of sources. One source involves the cultural and moral beliefs and values you learned in your family or local communities, such as schools, sports teams, religious and spiritual communities. So these two components, the barriers and the cultural biases, kind of are going to be the framework for my personal perspective and experience as I illustrate this to you. So here are some of the stories that I wanted to share with you. The first one has to do with my brother. I'm the third in 4 boys, and I'm the only one that was actually born here in the U.S. Everyone else was born in Nicaragua, which is where both of my parents are from. Central America, right above Costa Rica. I think we're starting to locate ourselves there. So my brother, while he was in high school, he worked at a Church's Chicken in a city called Linwood, which is very close to Compton, a much more known city. And he was doing the night shift, and a young black male comes into the store and draws a gun and points it at him and says, "Open the register, and then after that, let's walk outside." You can imagine what would go through my brother's mind. And then as he's outside, there's a little alley, a very dark alley. It doesn't even have a light. And he says, "Walk, and don't look back. And if you do, I will shoot you." So he walks, takes some steps, and he's thinking, is he for reals? Is he just going to shoot me because I've seen his face? And he keeps walking. That traumatic experience scarred his perspective and view of anybody that belonged to this racial group. And having personally worked with him, I saw how it even delved into his professional environment, how he communicated with anybody that belonged to that racial group, how he hired, how he disciplined. And growing up with that, I also experienced the comments and the feedback and the perspective at home that he brought, and that he would just say it out loud. And that personally affected me in the interaction that I had with anybody belonging to this group, to this racial group. So I began to have some unwarranted concerns. I began to put my guard up, and I began to create distance between me and anybody that belonged to that racial group that was a little bit darker than me. That was just one of the experiences. Another one, quite recently, my mother lives in the U.S. 6 months out of the year and 6 months in Nicaragua. She has a beautiful property out there, and she has a tenant whom she wanted to remove because they just weren't paying rent. They just were being bad tenants. And when she decided to do this, she confronted the man and asked him to vacate. And this man threatened her and said, "I have a 20/20 vision. Did you know that? And I'm pretty good with arms." And he actually justified this simply because he was a self-addressed or described gringo, a male American, a white male American, saying, "I can do this. I'll get away with it. I have more power and privilege than you do because they need to take care of me more than they need to take care of you." And that was a clear demonstration of someone using his power and privilege to attack someone else's dignity, even in a space that was supposed to be safe. Her home, her country, her neighborhood, her property, surrounded by family and friends. And yet here she was with that experience. And the last narrative that I want to bring home, and all 3 of these I'm going to use throughout the presentation, is my personal experience. In the recent years, I was under a director who happened to be a white female from Dallas. And I saw how she used her power and the power of her title to establish power with her subordinates. To say, "I am the boss and I will do whatever I want." And she made that clear. So clear that she intentionally withdrew some of the opportunities that I had to advance in leadership, in finances, in opportunities. And she used what little cultural competence or awareness that she had to have me in a small bucket, to reduce me to only the color of my skin. And I'll give you an example of that. While I was working on a training manual, I was in charge of just grabbing everything that we had. It was a fairly new training team, a corporate training team, and I was in charge of just getting everything together and putting it together in one single format, reviewing it, making sure that there were no grammatical mistakes or errors. And one of those days, she comes up to me and asks, "Norland, can I ask you a question?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." And she asks, is English your second language? I didn't know how to answer that question, first of all, because, yeah, I spoke Spanish at home, but I spent most of my time with my friends and at school and at work, which is English. But I said, yes, it is my second language. And I said, oh, okay. Or she said, okay, that explains things. And I said, really? What does that explain? Unpack that for me. And she said, because in this section I was reading, I noticed that there were some grammatical errors and some sentence structure issues there. And I said, really? Let me look into that. So I looked at the section that she was referring to, and I immediately chuckled, because little did she know that it wasn't written by me, and I hadn't gotten to that point where I was reviewing that, but it actually came from a white woman born and raised in San Francisco. And that was just one example of how she used her little and limited cultural competence or awareness to reduce me to just the color of my skin and what she thought she knew about who I am. And I'm so glad that in the session that we were just in, the intersectionality of identities came up, that topic, because I'm going to discuss a little bit about that. Now, you can imagine with the three narratives that I've given you, that it'll be easy for me to say and take a position of resistance and defense, to say, fight the power and demand change of everyone else. Easy to look at everyone but myself and say, they need to change. The structure needs to change, not me. And I'll share something a little bit more vulnerable with you. I had this tension in me in what I'm about to say to you, because I don't want to be seen as someone that submitted, that gave in or gave up, that is betraying my cultural background, my people, my identity, because the matter of the fact is that I'm not taking that position. And I would urge that we don't take that position and that we actually take a different position, which is what we've been discussing in the last 40 minutes, cultural humility. And I decided to do a little self-evaluation. And Fisher-Bourne says cultural humility leads us to accurately view and take responsibility for our limitations. So I did that. I looked at the limitations and the responsibilities that I had personally through the experiences, or some of the experiences that I've already mentioned to you. And I saw how I was projecting onto others what others had done onto me. And you can imagine, I'm employed at Biola University, a predominantly white institution, and coming under another white woman now, another white woman a female director. And I did some self-evaluation, and I said, you know what, this is not going to be the same. It can't be the same. But it needs to start with me. So let me do some self-evaluation. Let me see what kind of experience I can actually set for myself. And I saw that if I projected onto her what someone else had done, it would even avoid or eliminate the possibility of a good relationship, a professional relationship, of growth, of me enjoying my job. So I decided to be vulnerable with her and invite her into a conversation in hopes that she would meet me where I was at, understand me, and both of us together move forward. And I did. I told her, this is the experience that I had. This is how my voice has been suppressed. This is how my identity has not been validated. I need you to meet me where I'm at. And from that point forward, we can both move forward together. And we have. And I can't tell you what a blessing, I can't tell you what a huge success that has been over the last 2 years of my life. Now, it is necessary for us to have a posture of humility to acknowledge our responsibility and our own limitations, whether that be individually or with the help of others. Now, in this posture of humility, we can see what Dean says, which is maintaining an awareness of one's lack of competence is the goal rather than the establishment of competence. If I had remained in the establishment of competence, I would have said that is who they are and everybody else is the same. But then I looked internally and I said, that can't be, because that's not who I am. That's not who I wanted anybody else to see. But even in the acknowledgement of my personal responsibilities and limitations, I can see that I am also personally responsible for power imbalances as a minority in my church, in my faith community, in my neighborhood, in my own family. Personally speaking, Now, in professionally speaking, with those who are under me, who I lead, with the students I serve, with those who are around me that I have influence on because of the title that I have, because of the position that I have, there is a gap that I wished that this director that had such limited experience with me, I wish that she had closed before our interactions. And that's the gap of intersectionality of identities. Not being reduced to just one single identity, of especially a visual one. So Fisher-Bourne says that intersectionality disrupts the idea of social identities, such as race, ethnicity, gender, operating in isolation, and instead posits that individuals should be understood as whole and complex beings. I want to be understood as whole and complex because I am all of this. I am Central American. I am a U.S. citizen. Yes, I am a male. I am a father. I'm a husband. I'm a director. I'm a first-generation college student. I am a PhD student now. I am a leader in my community, in my family, and those around me. I want to be acknowledged as that. What cultural humility also does, it doesn't only just ask of us to look at ourselves and do self-evaluation, but once we get to that point where we see the gaps, now we're in charge. Now we are responsible to close those gaps, personally speaking, and to extend that to others. So then we see Fisher-Bourne once again saying that cultural humility focuses on knowledge of self in relation to others, acknowledges the dynamic nature of culture, and challenges barriers that impact marginalized communities on both the individual and the institutional levels. And that's what I'm doing. And that's the position that I'm taking. So the hope is that you don't see someone who has gave up or molded to the power, to the surroundings, to the environment, but someone who has done a lot of self-reflection and has taken a posture of humility that we could all take and say, I want to close the gap for myself, and I also want to close the gap for others who are experiencing the same type of narrow-mindedness. And now, to finish, culture, humility for all. Garran and Rosas, they say, because people are seen within the context of a dynamic social structure, the role that power and privilege have in shaping the lived experiences of any individual, whether they be targeted or dominant, is crucial in understanding the often shifting creation of a social consciousness that either helps expand or limit a person's opportunities. And I've experienced both ends of this. I've experienced the end of being limited because of someone's limited access or awareness, and I've also seen the other end of this, the opposite end of the opportunities that come by partnering, by coming together and talking and having this dialogue. There is something beautiful that happens when we engage in cultural humility. The experience that we have with individuals and conversations that surround the sensitivity of cultural humility. And I'll tell you some of those right now just to end. Personally speaking, this is what's happened since I've done some self-evaluation and since I've found people who are willing to step into that arena with me and meet me where I am, not because I couldn't be further along, just that's the reality of where I was, and come and partner with me and move forward. Some of the outcomes are affirmation. I've received a lot of affirmation for who I am. Something that was removed, something that was taken away from me in so many settings. Now I found that people who don't look like me affirm me. People that look like me affirm me. And I want to do the same thing. I've found a lot of healing. In Nicaragua, we are a very, very politically driven people. We are revolutionaries at heart. Che Guevara is on every street in our neighborhoods. I have like 3 shirts of just Che Guevara. That's in my heart. Because of fight the power, the resistance, right? Equity. And you can see how initially I would have said, let's fight the power together. Let's go after the man that created these structures that are not equitable, that are not just for someone like me. And the experiences that I shared with you, I could have just stayed there and be filled with bitterness and hate. But I found some healing in having these conversations. I found some healing in people who want and are willing to engage in these conversations, who are willing to be vulnerable with me. I've also found a sense of equity. Just being in this setting right now, 2 PhDs and a PhD student, 2 white males and a Central American, different statuses. I have felt a sense of equity in the collaboration that we've done. It's such a healing aspect of this. There is a sense of belonging. And it's a little weird to say that since I'm not in psychology. And I do feel a sense of belonging with everyone in this room, because you are willing to step into that field, into that context. So my hope is that, just to pull it all together, is that you see one narrative that contains both sides, and we begin to ask ourselves the questions: how do I serve those around me? How do I view my students, my clients, my family, my friends, those individuals in my society? How do I understand them for who they are, the intersectionality of identities? Not just what I think I see, but let me take the time to know who they really are. And I keep telling this to Dr. Sambora that in my next life, I'm going to be a psychologist. It is never too late. But, but so how do we engage with this? And by seeing both ends of a narrative, my hope that you are also motivated and inspired by the positive outcomes of taking a humble, a posture of humility. And it doesn't show weakness, it shows strength, because there's so much positive that comes out of that. So thank you.